Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into the Golden State, California, to try and understand the economic turbulence that it's been facing recently. You've provided some pretty stark articles and research materials for us to go over, and honestly, it seems like California has gone from sunshine and opportunity to struggle and uncertainty practically overnight. So let's unpack why that is and maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at the factors driving California's economic downturn, starting with the housing market crash and then pivoting to the state's unique tax structure. We'll also be exploring the ripple effects on education, the film industry, and even the prison system.
And since you're particularly interested in the human side of things, we'll definitely be looking at how all of this impacts everyday Californians. Think tent cities popping up all over the state, college becoming a distant dream for many, even Hollywood productions fleeing California. One of the things that really struck me when I was going through all of this material you sent over was just how widespread the impact of this downturn has been. It's not just a blip on the radar. This is a system-wide shock that's affecting every corner of the state.
It's true, yeah. This isn't just a few businesses closing. One source even went so far as to call it the most severe economic crisis California has faced since the Great Depression. We're talking about unemployment rates exceeding 12%, a wave of home foreclosures, and a homelessness crisis that's impossible to ignore.
wow, those are some stark figures. It really makes you wonder how a state known for its prosperity and innovation could find itself in such dire straits. I know we usually think of California as being home to Hollywood and a thriving entertainment industry, so I was surprised to see how hard that sector was hit too. I mean, you'd think that would have cushioned the blow a little, wouldn't you?
You would think so, wouldn't you? Surprisingly, that wasn't the case. Even Hollywood felt the heat, and the articles you shared highlight just how vulnerable it was. The 2008 writers' strike, followed by the threat of an actors' strike, brought productions to a standstill. And it wasn't a short pause. Many productions actually packed up and moved to states like New Mexico and Louisiana that were offering enticing tax breaks.
So California, the entertainment capital of the world, was losing business to states known more for their landscapes than their sound stages. That's kind of ironic, isn't it, what happened there?
It is ironic, and it all boils down to money. California's tax structure, while well-intentioned in many ways, made it incredibly difficult to compete with these other states who were offering significant financial incentives. The film industry in California took a real hit, and it wasn't just the big-shot actors and directors who felt the pain. Thousands of behind-the-scenes workers, the crew members, the costume designers, they all felt the pinch as production slowed down or moved out of state.
It's like this domino effect you were talking about earlier, isn't it? One part of the system stumbles and suddenly everything starts toppling. And it sounds like this domino effect didn't stop with Hollywood. From what I gathered from these articles, California's education system seems to have been hit especially hard. What did you find?
That's right, and the articles paint a pretty bleak picture. Public universities in California faced massive budget cuts. We're talking about funding reportedly plummeting from $33 billion to a meager $12 billion. To cope, tuition fees were hiked, classes were slashed, and student debt skyrocketed.
So instead of being a pathway to opportunity, education became less attainable just when people needed it most. I imagine that didn't go over well with students and educators.
You're right, it didn't. The articles mention protests and demonstrations erupting across California as students and teachers rallied against the drastic cuts and what they saw as the dismantling of their once revered education system.
Were there any stories in the research that really brought this to life for you?
One article told the story of a young woman named Maria who had dreamed of becoming the first in her family to graduate from college. She had excelled in high school and earned a scholarship, but when these budget cuts hit, her scholarship was reduced and the classes she needed were constantly being canceled or over-enrolled. She ended up having to work two jobs to make ends meet, which meant cutting back on her classes and delaying her graduation by 2 years. Stories like Maria's really highlight the human cost of these economic downturns and how they can derail dreams and aspirations.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it? Education should be the great equalizer, the path to a brighter future. But here it seems like it became another casualty of the economic turmoil. And from what I can tell from this research, the situation wasn't any brighter when we look at California's prison system, which was already dealing with its own set of challenges even before the downturn hit.
You're right. California's prisons were already grappling with overcrowding, with some reports indicating they were operating at double their capacity. But then, as the state tried to balance its budget, everything was on the chopping block, and they looked at rehabilitation programs designed to help inmates reintegrate into society.
Wait, so not only were the prisons overcrowded, but the programs meant to offer a second chance were being cut. That seems counterproductive, to say the least. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Of course. The research you sent suggests that these rehabilitative programs, while they may have seemed like an easy target for cuts, were actually quite effective in reducing recidivism rates. But as funding dwindled, they were deemed expendable, which ultimately increased the likelihood of former inmates ending up back behind bars. It's a classic example of how short-term thinking can sometimes lead to bigger problems down the road.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, though, if these programs were so effective, why were they the first to go?
That's a great question. One factor is that the benefits of rehabilitation programs can take years to materialize. They're not a quick fix, and when faced with an immediate budget crisis, it's tempting for policymakers to prioritize programs that offer more immediate, tangible results. Unfortunately, this often means that investments in social programs that address the root causes of crime and recidivism are the first to be cut.
It's tragic, really. It's like these individuals already facing an uphill battle were essentially being set up for failure. It feels like a missed opportunity to not only improve lives, but also address the root causes of crime and recidivism. It wasn't just the government-run programs that were impacted, though, right? I seem to recall something about NGOs also feeling the pinch.
You're absolutely right. NGOs that played a crucial role in providing rehabilitative services to former inmates, things like job training, housing assistance, and counseling, also saw their funding slashed. These organizations, often working on shoestring budgets, were suddenly thrust into an impossible situation, unable to provide the critical support needed to help individuals successfully reintegrate into society.
It's like this cascade of consequences, each one compounding the next. I'm starting to see how this downturn created this ripple effect across the state. Now, you mentioned earlier that California's tax structure played a role in all of this. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Of course. Many of the articles you sent pointed to California's tax structure as a major contributing factor to the state's budget woes. See, when the housing market crashed, property tax revenues, which are a key source of income for the state, plummeted. This was compounded by a decline in consumer spending as people tightened their belts, which further reduced sales tax revenue. These factors combined created a perfect storm that left California staring down a massive budget deficit.
And a massive deficit it was. One of these articles mentioned Governor Schwarzenegger grappling with a $42 billion shortfall back in 2009. That's an almost unfathomable number. I'm wondering if you could explain to me, and I know this might seem like a silly question, but how does the state even end up with that kind of deficit? It's not like they overspent on their credit card, right?
That's a great question, and you're right. It's not as simple as overspending on a credit card. Think of it this way. Every year, the state government creates a budget that outlines how much money they expect to bring in through taxes and other sources of revenue, and how they plan to spend that money on things like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and so on. Now, when the economy takes a downturn, like what happened in California, people lose their jobs, housing prices fall, and consumer spending decreases. This, in turn, means that the state collects less money in taxes than they had anticipated.
So they're essentially in the same boat as someone who suddenly has to take a pay cut,
Yeah.
less money coming in, but the bills keep piling up.
Exactly. And in California's case, that bill was a whopping $42 billion. That left the state in a really tough spot, having to find ways to either cut spending or increase revenue, all while navigating a complex political landscape.
Speaking of that political landscape, I imagine those budget negotiations must have been pretty intense. I remember reading about Governor Schwarzenegger, a Republican, having to work with a Democrat-controlled legislature.
Absolutely. And the articles you provided really highlight how California's system, which requires a two-thirds majority in the legislature to approve any tax increases, made enacting swift and decisive action incredibly difficult. Governor Schwarzenegger, despite his best efforts, faced strong opposition from the Democrat-controlled legislature, who were reluctant to raise taxes in the midst of an economic crisis.
So they were basically caught between a rock and a hard place, a massive budget deficit, a tax system that made it difficult to raise revenue, and political gridlock that stalled any meaningful action. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Did they ever manage to find any solutions?
It was a precarious situation, to say the least. And with traditional avenues for generating revenue effectively blocked, policymakers started exploring more unconventional solutions.
Unconventional solutions. Does this have something to do with that article I sent about legalizing cannabis? It almost felt like a footnote in the grand scheme of things, but I was curious to see where you'd take it.
You're right. It might seem like a footnote, but it actually played a significant role in California's attempts to navigate its economic crisis. Remember, this was back in 2009 and 2010 when the state was facing that massive budget shortfall. California had already legalized medical cannabis back in 1996, and it had become a booming industry, but they took it a step further, putting forward a referendum in 2010 to legalize cannabis for recreational use.
So they were essentially looking to cannabis as a potential cash cow to replenish their depleted coffers. I can see how that might be appealing, but also a bit of a gamble.
Precisely. Projections at the time estimated that taxing legalized cannabis could generate upwards of $2.5 billion annually in tax revenue for the state. It was seen by some as a financial lifeline, a way to offset some of those crippling budget cuts and fund essential services. But you're right, it was a gamble and it sparked heated debates across the state.
I imagine there were strong opinions on both sides of that issue.
Absolutely. You had strong arguments on both sides. Opponents raised concerns about the cultural and social implications, arguing that legalizing cannabis would send the wrong message, particularly to young people, and could lead to increased drug use and addiction. Others worried about the impact on workplace productivity and public safety.
And on the other side, you had those who saw it as a step in the right direction, right?
Exactly. Proponents of legalization argued that it would allow the state to regulate and tax a substance that was already widely used, taking it out of the hands of the black market. They argued this would generate much-needed revenue that could be used to fund education, healthcare, and other vital programs. They pointed to the failures of prohibition, arguing that it was more effective, both from a societal and economic standpoint, to regulate and control cannabis than to try and ban it outright.
It's fascinating to see how an issue like cannabis legalization became so intertwined with California's economic crisis. It's almost like a microcosm of the larger debate over the role of government, social policy, and economic pragmatism.
It's a classic example of how economic crises can force societies to confront complex issues and make difficult decisions, often with far-reaching consequences that we're still grappling with today. But as interesting as this is, you wanted to know more about the bigger picture. Even with potential revenue from cannabis legalization, California was still facing an uphill battle. Did they ever manage to pull themselves out of that downward spiral? The research paints a somewhat mixed picture.
So even with these efforts to stabilize the state's finances, there were still concerns about the long-term economic outlook. Did the research offer any insights into that?
Well, according to the projections at the time from these articles, it seems California was likely to remain in a financial deficit in 2010 with a projected shortfall of $13 billion. Experts predicted that a full economic recovery could take several years, and even then, there were no guarantees.
So a lot of uncertainty hanging over the Golden State. This deep dive has been quite the eye-opener. We've gone from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood to the harsh realities of tent cities popping up across the state. It really highlights how interconnected our systems are and how quickly things can unravel when one part goes haywire.
Absolutely. And it underscores the profound human cost of economic downturns. Behind the statistics and the policy debates are real people whose lives were upended, whose dreams were deferred, and whose futures were thrown into uncertainty.
It's a sobering thought. Speaking of those human costs, I'm remembering all the details in these articles about how the downturn impacted the entertainment industry. It's one thing to hear that productions were stalled or moved out of state, but I'm really curious about the people. What happened to the thousands of workers who relied on Hollywood for their livelihoods?
Yeah, it was a difficult period for many in the industry. We're talking about seasoned professionals, from costume designers to set builders, facing unemployment for the first time in their careers. Many had to make very difficult choices, like leaving the state altogether in search of opportunities elsewhere.
So the brain drain wasn't limited to tech or finance. Even the creative heart of California was hemorrhaging talent. Did these articles you sent offer any glimmers of hope for Hollywood's future?
There's a sense of cautious optimism in some of the reports. They highlight the industry's remarkable resilience and its ability to adapt, even if it's sometimes out of necessity. One article mentioned independent filmmakers seizing the opportunity to fill the void left by departing productions, breathing new life into the California film scene.
It's like that saying, nature abhors a vacuum. Even in the face of adversity, creativity finds a way to blossom. But did Hollywood ever fully recover? Did it regain its status as the undisputed center of the entertainment universe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While the sources you provided don't offer a definitive answer, they do suggest that the landscape of the entertainment industry had fundamentally shifted. The rise of streaming services, which was already underway, accelerated during this period, further decentralizing production and creating new opportunities outside of traditional Hollywood studios.
So California may have remained a major player, but the game had changed. It's a reminder that even seemingly unshakable institutions can be reshaped by forces beyond their control. This has been an incredible deep dive, thank you. Taking a look at California's economic roller coaster, from the housing crash to the impact on education, the prison system, and even Hollywood has been fascinating.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. The housing crash triggered this domino effect that impacted everything from universities to prisons.
It makes you wonder what the future holds for a state that was once seen as a beacon of prosperity and opportunity. Will the Golden State reclaim its mantle as the land of opportunity? Or is this the dawn of a new era, one marked by uncertainty and a redefining of the California dream? I guess that's something for you to ponder. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. If this exploration sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to explore further. We'll include links to the source material in our show notes. Until next time, keep asking questions and stay curious.